So let's think about where gender comes from. And so, a few questions I want us to ponder as we move along in this week is how do we learn about gender? And think about it. I want you to think back in your history. When did you first learn that you were a boy or a girl or something in between? Are we born with gender? We're born with sex for sure, but are we born with gender? And if we're not born with it, well, where does it come from? We're not born with it. It must be learned. And if it's learned, then how is it learned? Where is it learned? When is it learned? What would you say if I said that gender is a verb? Gender is something that we do. Gender expectations are taught and messages are presented to us in a whole bunch of different ways in the media, in schools, among friends, by family members. Another way to say this is that gender is a social construct that we as a society have created. It's made from external, cultural, and environmental factors, things like how we view ourselves and how we view one another. And in one of the most famous articulations of the difference between sex and gender, Simone de Beauvoir wrote that one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. De Beauvoir doesn't mean us to believe that no one is born with reproductive organs, right? So it's not literal. It's more that the social role of woman, or being a man for that matter, comes from a collection of behaviors that we're socialized into. And so this distinction is really crucial for understanding most feminist and queer theory and the variety of human identity more generally, but it's one that often gets lost in the popular usage of the words sex and gender. Biology doesn't determine gender differences, culture does. Gender becomes naturalized, it becomes woven so tightly into the social fabric of our lives that it seems like part of reality rather than a production of history. But there's also some variation in the extent to which we follow the roles that are presented to us. There's an interactive role between an individual and society's expectations with regards to gender. In 1987, sociologists Candace West and Don Zimmer coined the term doing gender. This refers to the process of creating gender through interactions in a particular social setting. In other words, gender may be challenged and revised, both in individual interactions but also institutional settings. West and Zimmerman describe the concept as a routine accomplishment in our daily lives. We do gender all the time. When we put on makeup, when we paint our nails, when we pick up football, when we change a tire, we do gender all the time. Okay. So it's not what a person is, but rather what a person does in interaction with others. For example, when a man opens a door for a woman, it's considered being a polite gentleman. In terms of doing gender, the man was reinforcing an idea of gender through his actions in a particular social setting. It marks a gender difference because the gesture was either a sign of respect or an assumption that women are the weaker sex and need help from men. After a while, these gender differences become ordinary. They become part of what we do. Trying to say we shouldn't hold the door open for people. Of course we should. Okay. But these roles, these ideals just get built in to our expectations. Doing gender is also taught through the context of social structures and institutions. Within families, schools, workplaces, people use their power to enforce gender roles. We see conformity to gender norms, right? So doing gender typical things, like women wearing dresses and men wearing pants. We see that get encouraged and reinforced. Remember, we talked about reinforcement by criticizing or really looking down on people who choose to challenge traditional gender roles. And what this does is it results in social stratification, men being shown as dominant, women being shown as submissive, and we end up with these continuous power differentials. Gender socialization starts early. It starts before birth, even. Okay, think about a pregnant woman. When you find out someone's expecting, what's the first question you ask? Is it a boy or a girl, right? First, baby showers, nurseries, even the ways parents talk to their unborn child. Children are gendered from the very start before they're even born. It's we're buying pink stuff or we're buying blue stuff. Why do we do that? Right? Why is that important? All babies look the darn same, but it's an egregious offense to take your little girl out dressed in blue pants and have people proclaim over your handsome son. But when you ask parents to describe male and female infants, who for all purposes really look the same, parents will describe them differently. Dads will refer to their baby girls as soft and sweet. Moms will refer to their sons as strong as masculine. So from the start, we push gender on to kids. Now, I'm sure you've heard of gender reveal parties, right? Where people reveal the identity of their baby. But is gender reveals really the correct phrase? Argue that it's not. And in fact, every time I see one in the media or a friend having one, I get very feisty about it because it's not actually a gender reveal. It's actually a sex reveal. All that's telling us is whether the baby has a penis or a vagina. It's not telling us whether they are a boy or a girl or how they will identify when they get older. And I challenge you to think about whether that's something that we should let children choose for themselves. There's a lot of controversy around that statement. A lot of controversy. A lot of people will argue that letting children choose their gender identity or exposing them to different gender ideologies can be confusing for them. If that's your viewpoint, then that's your viewpoint. Let me just present a different one, though. Why does it matter? Why does it matter if a child is a boy or a girl? Why do we have to break up into those different categories? Why can't we just have people? A little bit of an out there view, but it's one that's kind of gaining traction in society. And we'll talk a little bit more coming up about what could happen if we don't gender type our children. Think about the child called X that I asked you to read. If gender is learned, that means it's taught. And like most things, it's commonly taught by parents. Parents play perhaps the largest role here because they're the ones who are providing access to toys and essentially choosing what our children are exposed to. Unsurprisingly, they tend to choose gender typical toys and activities and display positive reactions to gender conforming behaviors. And so, what I mean by that is when we see a little girl playing with dolls, we tend to say, "Oh, girl, you're so sweet playing with your dolls." And when we see a little boy playing with trucks, it's good job, little man. You're so strong. Look how good of a job you're doing. Our little social modelers then file that information away. Okay, I'm a girl. Doll good, truck bad. Therefore, it's not surprising that preschoolers increasingly prefer same sex peers and gender typed activities. For boys, that means active, competitive, large group play like soccer. While for girls, it involves quieter activities involving cooperative roles like playing house or playing school. You might wonder why we care about that. Why does that matter? Well, think about the roles that we're setting them up for. By encouraging boys to engage in activities that develop gross motor skills, the ability to run, jump, play, be creative. We're setting them up for different paths, different career options than girls who were taught to sit quietly, play with dolls, be carers, be nurturers. Why do we care about that, you might ask? Well, it's not those carer and nurturer roles that make a lot of money, right? So what we're doing is we're setting boys up from the get-go with we're putting them on a path towards higher income earning than we are with girls, which contributes to systematic inequality in society. Um, and back to the question of, well, isn't this confusing for children? I guess it could be, but children are remarkably open-minded and they're remarkably resilient. They're also remarkably observant. Children quite young will look longer at gender non-conforming behaviors than gender conforming ones. So what I mean by that is babies will look longer at pictures of men putting on lipstick than women putting on lipstick because it's gender atypical. So they're seeing this quite young, regardless of what we do. The question then becomes, what do we want to do about it? Do we want to teach them that it's something to be shamed of, or do we want to teach them that, yeah, there's a lot of different gender identities and that's just how the world is? Come to your own conclusion. As children get older, this all starts to extend to the expectations we have for gender typical characteristics. Okay, like I said, we expect boys to value traits like achievement, competition, emotional control. And there's so much of a push and expectation for boys to conform than girls. We push girls towards traits like warmth, politeness, closely supervised activities. And it's not just parents, all adults are guilty of this. Teachers too. Teachers often accidentally gender their students. Boys, keep it down. Look how nicely the girls are playing. Things like that. There's also a lot of evidence that we push gender normed activities, pushing boys into learning science and math, pushing girls towards the arts, which speaks to the point that I made earlier. Children also tend to play more with same sex peers, which then leads to gender normative behavior in everything from toy choices, activities, how they dress, aggressive behaviors, and so on. As early as age 3, we start to see children praising each other for gender typed play while criticizing cross gendered activities, such as boys who wants to play house. Social influence is also important. Girls tend to play in small groups, which leads to developing greater communication skills and concern for one another's needs. Boys tend to play in larger groups and must therefore rely on commands, threats, and physical force to be heard. Girls learn pretty quickly that gentle communicative tactics that work well with other girls don't work as well with boys, making the girls even less likely to interact with boys. And children's everyday environments are absolutely loaded with gender norms. Things like media stereotypes, occupations, leisure activities, the ways that we talk about men and women more broadly. So I wonder what you think about how toys might influence gender development. Um, I'll play a few minutes of this. It's a TED Talk, so it's a little bit long. I'll play a few minutes and then you can watch the rest on your own if you're interested.
Gender. There's so many toys today. So, in most stores, and this is true online and in brick and mortar, toys are segregated according to gender. They're sold in different aisles. Sometimes this is achieved through signs, as you see here, boys' activity toys and girls' building sets. But more often, it's achieved through more implicit mechanisms like color coding. As you see here, we have a very pink aisle and a very blue aisle. Now, these images are actually pictures I shot myself in our local Target store back in April. And some of you may have heard that Target announced in August that they were going to stop using these kinds of pink and blue backdrops and those signs, that they were going to move towards a more gender neutral presentation. And in the wake of this announcement, there was a lot of people like me who are very excited to hear it, but there were also a lot of people who thought that this was a very bad thing, and they flooded Target's Facebook page with comments. And some of those comments even went so far as to suggest that this would lead to a gender apocalypse where boys and girls would be lost in the store, unsure of what toy to select. So, to give you a sense of what this actually looked like, this change actually looked like on the ground, this is the same exact toy aisle. One image that I shot in April, this one here, and the other that I shot a week after the Target toy announcement. And so what you can see is that, yes, indeed, that pink aisle has become significantly less pink, and that's a good thing, but it's still pretty pink, right? You can still see the markings of gender, because it's not just the segregation of toys, it's also the very ideas about gender that are embedded in the toys themselves. So Toys for Girls center heavily on the ideas of beauty, nurturing, and domesticity, while Toys for Boys are much more about action, aggression, and excitement. So I first began to really notice this pink and blue divide when my daughter was born in 2002. This is she and I shopping for toys right around the time of her first Christmas. And what struck me when I went into the toy aisles was how very different it looked from the toys that I remember from my own childhood. So I was born in the early 1970s, and here's some of the toys that I played with as a child. I had Lincoln Logs and Tinker Toys and Legos, and I never remember thinking these were boys' toys that I was playing with. They were just toys for kids. And my favorite toys were these Fisher-Price Little People sets. We had this castle. The castle was super fun because it had a trapdoor on the top, and you could drop the figures down, and they would fall dramatically into a dungeon. And again, I don't remember thinking this toy had anything to do with my gender. In fact, if you look at this advertisement, it was marketed broadly to children, and the child in there looks to me a bit like a boy. So I don't remember things being the way that they were when my daughter was born. But I'm a sample size of 1. I teach statistics, so we know that sample size of 1 is not enough to make a generalization. And so I decided that I wanted to study this topic empirically. And in my dissertation research and now postdoctoral research here at UC Davis, I analyzed over 7,000 Sears catalog toy advertisements from various time points over the 20th century to try to understand how the gender marketing of children's toys had changed over time and why. Now, there's a ton of things I could tell you about this research. I could talk to you all day about it, but I actually want to talk to you about one of the very most basic points that emerges from this research, and that is this. Toys are far more gendered today than they were at any point over the 20th century. Toys are more gendered than they have ever been before. Now, that's not to say that gender played no role in the toys of the past. It certainly did, as you can see in these two advertisements behind me. One, a 1922 Erector Set ad, which says, "Boys today, men tomorrow." And this 1964 Look magazine ad, which shows a girl surrounded by domestic toys. Certainly, gender did play a role. But it is to say that even when in the periods over the 20th century when toys were the most gendered, there were still far more toys that weren't defined by gender. Roughly half of toys that weren't defined by gender. And that's a lot more than we see today. Toys like these dolls from 1915 Sears catalog, which are advertised as being just fine for small children. So again, there's lots of things I could tell you about my research, but today I want to focus really on what this means for children, that we've gone from this to those pink and blue aisles that we see today. What does that mean for kids? So bracketing my role as a researcher, I can tell you what it's meant for me as a parent and for my own child. And perhaps the best example I can give you of this actually has nothing to do with a toy, it has to do with a lunchbox. So it was about a week before my daughter's first day of kindergarten, and we were doing some school shopping, and we're standing in front of the wall of lunchboxes. And she was never a fan of the pink aisle, and so she pretty quickly rejected all the pink princess sparkles. But she also wasn't really a fan of superheroes, so she rejected the red and blue and black superhero themes, which left very little in the middle. But eventually she sees this pale green lunchbox, and it's really cool. It's a dinosaur-themed lunchbox that had a tail that Velcroed open, and so when you did, it made the shape of a dinosaur. And when she sees that, that's the one she wants. And I think, yeah, that's great. Well, she could already read at this point, okay? So as she's taking the lunchbox off the shelf, she happens to see the tag on the lunchbox, which says, "Plain as day, boys lunchbox." And just like that, I could see the doubt cloud her eyes. And she began to say, "I don't think I want that lunchbox. I'm not supposed to have that lunchbox." Okay, now you better believe that she and I had a long heart-to-heart in that store that day about how ridiculous this idea that this dinosaur lunchbox is for boys only, as if only boys can play with dinosaurs, as if half of dinosaurs weren't female, right? This is ridiculous. That this is an arbitrary decision that somebody has made that does not reflect reality. And yeah, she got that, and she did go ahead and get that lunchbox. But you know what? She carried those seeds of doubt outside of the store with her that day. And she carried them into the kindergarten classroom the next week. In fact, we had to continue to have this conversation over and over about how it was okay for her to like that lunchbox. This experience with the lunchbox was really emblematic of her later experiences with toys, with shoes, with clothing, where over and over she would feel like she had to kind of hide or sometimes abandon things she really liked simply because they were coded as being for boys. Either because she was afraid she might be teased for liking them, or increasingly in later years because she actually was being teased for liking them. And my daughter is not alone. All kids kind of have to abandon or deny some parts of themselves in order to fit neatly into those pink and blue narrow boxes. And for those kids that do resist, that do refuse to do that, the social cost can be incredibly high. In 2014, Michael Moronis was 11 years old, and he was an avid fan of My Little Pony. Now, My Little Pony is a product line and show designed for little girls, although it has a much larger fan base. And Michael loved My Little Pony, but he was bullied relentlessly for his interest in this product and show. And eventually he could endure that bullying no longer, and he attempted to take his own life, 11 years old. Now, Michael's not alone. There are far too many children who every day have to endure harassment, teasing, and sometimes physical violence simply because they like something that's been arbitrarily coded for the other gender. It is needless and it is senseless. And beyond the unnecessary pain and suffering that gender-coded products create for individual children, which, by the way, should be more than enough reason for us to challenge it, but beyond that, they may have profound societal implications. We know from a wealth of social science research that the very same stereotypes that are the core defining feature of children's toys today, those gender stereotypes lay at the root of many of the processes that create and sustain gender inequality in the adult world. So gender inequalities like occupational segregation, the wage gap. We know, for example, that gender stereotypes can negatively impact task performance when they're seen as relevant. They can shape people's aspirations, how competent they believe themselves to be, and what they aspire to do. And this is true whether or not that person actually endorses the gender stereotype themselves. All that's necessary is for them to know it's out there and to know that other people believe it, for it to have a strong effect. And gender stereotypes can impact how competent others evaluate us to be. And so for all these reasons, the fact that gender stereotypes are the core defining feature of children's toys today should give us all pause. It should cause concern.
I'll stop it there, but if you're interested, you can watch the rest of the video. I always think she makes some really, really interesting points. Is it making you think any differently about the toys you had growing up, the toys that you played with, or maybe the toys you wanted to play with but didn't feel like you could? The next time you walk into a store, I want you to take a look around. Look at the toys. Look at how they're marketed. Look at how they're packaged. Just now realized that I didn't have my camera in the video in the screen. I'll slide it over now. Hello. Um, Take a look at the pink toys and the blue toys and the differences that you see between the two of them. Interesting, right? Um, do I want to show this one? I'll hold off on showing this one. You can watch it on your own. It's a really interesting little clip about how they take a boy and a girl and dress them up as the opposite sex and then have people interact with them. And we see that we interact with babies based on what gender we think that they are. In this case, they were completely wrong. But it shows that we treat children differently based on their sex or their gender. Sort of at this age, we'd really more appropriately be talking about sex. And so I would ask you, do you think you treat people differently based on their sex? You'd probably say no, and you'd probably be wrong because we all do that. And we'll talk more about stereotypes in a few weeks, but I'll leave it there for now. I asked you to read X, A Fabulous Child Story. I hope you did. It's a really interesting story. It's supposed to be satire, so it's intended to be a bit exaggerated, a bit ridiculous. But the main premise is that there's a child who's being raised without a gender. X is not a boy, X is not a girl, X is an X. And people had a really hard time with that. Society really struggled with that, just as I think they would if we were to actually try and do this experiment. X eventually went to school where they struggled with things like which bathroom to use, or when the teacher said girls line up here and boys line up here, X didn't know what to do. And all the other children started to, at first, were very confused by X, but eventually they started to realize, well, X gets to do all of the things. Instead of just getting to do girl things or just getting to do boy things, X gets to do everything. How cool is that? We've been missing out. And so then the parents started to get upset because they were concerned that their kids were going to get confused. The school brought in a team of evaluators to assess X to make sure that X was healthy, right, to see what was wrong with X. And what they found was that X was the most well adjusted child they'd ever examined. Now, again, intended to be sort of satirical, but I wonder what you all think about this idea. Can we have a society that doesn't have gender? Is it possible to just get rid of gender altogether? And if it is possible, should we? Right? That's a big question in psychology that you'll hear me ask several times. Just because we can, does that mean that we should? Along with toys, we can't have this conversation without mentioning the media. Right? Let's take a look at some of the leading men and women in Disney movies. Now, we portray Disney as wholesome, as safe. There's no concern when we plop a kid down in front of a Disney movie. They're not going to see anything that they shouldn't see. What do we notice about the idealized images of gender, of beauty that we're telling our children? Look at the women. What do you notice? Look how skinny they are. Look at their faces and their hair. It's perfect. It's fluffy. It's bouncy. Their eyes are huge. Their lips are full. Their posture is feminine. Their clothing is feminine. Even the colors, they're very pastel. Their postures. Look at their body language. They're standing in closed off positions. They're mostly wearing dresses. If you're a child who doesn't look like that, how do you interpret that? This is the idealized image of beauty for women. You don't look like that. What message is that sending? We can make the same argument for the men. Look at their postures. They're standing with their legs spread far apart in assertive, confident, dominant stances. They have arms crossed over broad chests, strong chests, big upper bodies. They have glorious hair. They're darker, more subdued colors. They're very stereotypically masculine. If you're a boy who doesn't look like that, how does that make you feel? So it's important to think about the fact that even in what we consider to be safe and wholesome children's media, we are still seeing idealized gender images getting pushed from really quite early on. Oh, and the media as well. This is a sort of silly video, but I'll play it anyway because it makes a good point.
The offense really needs to score here, but this defense just isn't giving an inch. It's down to this last play. Interception! He's across the midfield. He's at the 40. The 30. 20. 10. Touchdown!
There are two sides to GoDaddy. The sexy side, represented by Brett Raffaelli, and the smart side that creates a killer website for your small business, represented by Thelma. Together, they're perfect.
Obviously a little ridiculous, but the point is that we treat men and women differently. We sexualize women, and we often do it in advertising, in media. These are the images that children are seeing, whether or not we like it. And so the question becomes, well, why do we care, right? We've spent all this time talking about gender stereotypes and gendering of boys and girls and gender spectrums, and why do we care? Well, as we've seen and heard so far, pushing people into boxes that they don't fit into can really have a lot of detrimental effects for the individual. But that's not the only reason. It can create stereotypes or expectations based on gender. If we assume that doctors are men, teachers are women, and so on, it limits what we're able to do. If we hold stereotypes that boys are better than girls at math, we're probably not going to encourage girls to take STEM classes. If we believe that girls are more caring than boys, we might not encourage boys to enter nursing or health professions. Like any stereotype, gender stereotypes have the potential to be really quite harmful. And so I'll show you this short video about stereotypes and where they come from and how they're learned. And we can think about some of the things we can do to help minimize them.
Okay, so we have to get you a sword, a shield, blue pants. Oh, and I can give you the mustache I wore last Halloween. Oh, come on. So what if you didn't get the role of the princess? Being a knight is awesome. At least you're not playing a tree. Gender role stereotypes are when a person is expected to act in a certain way based on society's expectations related to their gender. Traditional gender roles go back to a time when there were clear and, at times, unequal rules about how people were expected to act based on their gender. People who were born male were expected to be strong and aggressive, not emotional, and, of course, to love sports. People who were born female were expected to be kind and nurturing, emotional, and domestic, meaning they were all supposed to be able to cook and clean. Gender role stereotypes also affect people's understanding of who is beautiful and who is not. People still go to great lengths to try and conform to these unrealistic ideals they see in popular media. They diet, obsessively exercise, and go through plastic surgery. Additionally, strict stereotypes about gender police people's emotions. Girls are not expected to show anger, and boys aren't supposed to be empathetic, nurturing, or vulnerable. Luckily, as times have changed, so have people's expectations about gender roles. More and more people are free to behave in ways that are true to who they really are, and that is a good thing.
Again, we'll talk more about stereotypes in a few weeks when we get to social psychology, but The challenge I have for you as we wrap up this section of the lecture is, what are some things that you can do differently to help break these gender stereotypes that we have in society? What are some ways that you can act, or some behaviors that you can engage in, or even just some thought patterns you can change that might help to reduce gender stereotypes and make things more equal across society?
Until next time.
Up next, we'll talk about when gender and sex don't match. For the most part, we've been talking about sort of stereotypes and ideas more broadly, but I want to swing back to this idea of people who are transgender, whose gender and sex don't match up, and some of the challenges and issues that they face. So I'll see you then.